Welcome, everybody, to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Kwame Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode is one that will have you coming back for more. And if you're a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, as always, I welcome you back and I hope that today's episode is one that you find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So before we get to our main event, if you are on YouTube, please make sure you hit that red subscribe button so we can get future notifications on new episodes. Also, if you're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other audio platform, make sure you subscribe there as well. We also do accept monetary donations from folks who want to help us continue to build this platform, and we accept it in four ways, either through Cash App, with our handle $IDTALK4ED, Venmo with our handle @KwameSM, PayPal with our URL paypal.me/KwameSM. And for my day ones, for those who have been faithful listeners and viewers of this podcast and all things Identity Talk, you can become a patron today by joining the community on Patreon. There you'll get behind the scenes footage and some perks to show our appreciation for your support. And to catch past and future episodes of the podcast, make sure you subscribe or go to our main website at identitytalk4educators.com. And for my readers who are looking for some new books to add to their 2025 book list, make sure you include Learn to Relearn, Supporting Identity in a Culturally Affirming Classroom. It's been a couple months since it's been out, and I have to thank all those who have been posting the selfies on social media, all those who have been sharing about the book with their friends and colleagues and loved ones. All of the support is greatly appreciated on my end. And for those who want to share even more about what you've learned and love about the book, make sure you leave a review on Amazon, Goodreads, and other book retail platforms. That's how the visibility of the book will increase so that others can then know how dope the book is. And of course, you can go to the book's main website at learntorelearn.com. You'll be able to get information about the chapters, some supplemental resources you can use for the classroom, especially coming out of the winter break if you are still stateside, starting up school again. Lots of good stuff there. So make sure y'all go to that website, and thank you again for the support. All right, people. So we got another phenomenal guest. And this sister right here, I actually got a chance to meet last July when I was in Ghana for the Ghana ASCD International Educator Summit. And honestly, from that point on, I just been following her work, and she out there doing it. Like, I feel like every day I go into the news feed, there's something going on with McKenzie's Adventures, something going on where she's doing a keynote, a workshop, doing something within the States, something globally, and so much so that I was just intrigued and I just needed to learn more about her story. So guess what? We have her here today, and it's an honor to have Yaritza Villalba on the podcast to talk about her story, her work, and all that she's about to do in 2025 and beyond that. So we're going to get Yaritza on to talk with us. Hello.
Hello, everyone. Oh, I'm excited.
Yeah. How are you today?
I'm good. I'm relaxed. I'm ready for this conversation. Anytime there's a discussion around a theme of identity, it's like I'm all in. You know, a lot of my work centers on just me first knowing who I am in order to embrace who everyone else is around me and what their work is. So identity is a conversation that I believe everyone should be willing to have.
Yes. So listen, we know that, Brooklyn's in the building. We know Panama's in the building.
For sure.
So we'll make sure we shout both of those out. And I want to give you an opportunity to share a little bit about yourself right now and just tell us what actually inspired you to want to do this work that we love called education.
So, Kwame, I always knew I was going to be an educator. So, I taught for 11 years in Brooklyn, New York. I actually went back to the same high school I graduated from to become a teacher. But prior to that, as you mentioned, shout outs to Panama. I was born in Panama, and we migrated here in 1991 after the Americans invaded Panama. And so from there already, my life and my start was kind of rocky, right? Because for my mom, we were pushed out of a country onto this like new world and trying to figure out how we're going to have this fresh start. But in any immigrant household or foreign household or Caribbean household, the goal is the kids go to school to learn, and you bring back everything that you've learned that the adults can now, obtain that information because they're busy working. And so from a young age, I was already a teacher. I already had to differentiate instructions so that my mother could understand what I was learning in school. But also my sister had to differentiate, right? Because now I needed to learn about what she was doing, because my mom's whole thing was, I don't want you to be your best. I need you to be the best. School is a race. Everyone starts off at the same time, but you're going to leave some folks behind. And I need you not to feel bad when you do so. So that was my mother. And that's how my life was centered. I knew I was going to be an educator. They say when you start your bachelor's, it should take some time before you declare your major. I knew I was studying Africana studies. I knew I wanted to minor in education. I started my master's literally 4 months after. I knew I wanted to master in adolescent urban education and social studies. So it was like, come on, let's go, bring it on. I'm ready. And so when I began to teach, I actually taught overage undercredited students. So I was 21 teaching 21-year-olds. Mm-hmm. And the reality hit that everything they taught me in school and what I was at that time learning in grad school was just not for me. It wasn't for my kids. I didn't see people who looked like me, an Afro-Latina, in a master's program willing to learn about adolescent urban education. If anything, most of those first few weeks, the teacher spent trying to describe what urban education was. And I was like, what? This is Brooklyn. We are in the center of urban education. So trying to learn and just like your book, right? And relearn what education was, but for my students. I knew that I had already journeyed through high school and college, and I was already finding myself, but now was, let me backtrack and figure out why these students haven't graduated and why it's taken them 8 years to see a person like me in the classroom saying, you're going to graduate in 4 months. We got to do what we got to do. And we're going to show, and this is my favorite line, we're going to show these white people that you're capable of doing it. And I used to always say that because in New York, we know we have those state exams. And at that time, the folks who created the state exams were white and Caucasian. So that was my way of telling my kids, we're going to show them. Yes, you got a 14 and a 15. Now you're going to get 90s and 98s and 100s. And we're going to show them that it's not a matter of reading comprehension. It was just they created a curriculum that didn't align to who you were as an individual.
So you're talking about the Regents, right?
The Regents exam. Yep.
Yeah, the Regents exams. Yep. And it's still going on to this day.
Still going on. And my kids also had to take advanced placement U.S. history because in New York, they came up with some law that we had to expose students to the advanced placement curriculum. And so you had my students who some were reading on a 4th grade reading level, seeing text in context that looked like gibberish to them, right? And so as a teacher, I broke it down and we would do rap battles and we would do literally TikTok summaries with their parents. We would do, games of Jeopardy, VR glasses. So when we talk about technology, I was already introducing that to my students because they were of age and they understood what they wanted out of the class. I didn't have students who were just like, I'm here just to pass, right? It was more of, I did this 6 times, miss. What are you going to do different?
I hear that.
Yeah.
And I want to continue to go down that path. But before we do so, I want to go back in time because you did mention that your family came from Panama to New York in 91. And I'm not sure how old were you at that time?
I was 3.
3 years old.
Yep.
So you pretty much practically spent your whole life stateside. I'm wondering how some of those struggles that you had may have had an impact on you, maybe not being able to embrace your full identity
Mhm.
or not being able to show up as your full self, not just in school, but in other spaces as well.
Yeah. So growing, I was young, right? I was 3. So language acquisition was for me easy, right? I already was acquiring Spanish, and then you introduce English, and I'm like, okay, well, I got to learn vocabulary anyway. And so being able to learn English was like a 1, 2, 3 step deal.
Mm-hmm.
What was more difficult was educators making assumptions about what I knew. And so early on in school, I was already placed in ESL classes, which I never understood why, right? My English for me was perfect. I started off grade school in America, so it's not like I ever went to school in Panama. So everything that I had learned was literally from the American school system. And my entire K through 12 experience was with me in either what they called ESL classes or native classes. And it wasn't until I began to start my journey as a teacher where I realized, well, schools got more money for me if I took those ESL classes. Plus, no one had informed my mom that she had the option to sign me out of those roles. So, one, I struggled with trying to figure out where I belonged, right? Am I Black? Am I African American? Am I Latino? Am I Hispanic? With the Black community, appearance, I fit right in. But once my mom comes outside and she said, Yaritza Villalba, come upstairs, that's out the window. Everyone's laughing, right? My mom's accent is really, really, really strong. My aunt as well. And so whenever, they would speak to me in front of a group of people, I would kind of shrink up and shrivel up because I knew that the jokes were coming after. And then when I would hang around with Hispanics, I'm too dark, right? So when I do speak Spanish, it's like, oh, well, how did you know that? Like, I remember feeling like I was being interviewed, for knowing Spanish. How do you know that? And who taught you? And I'm like, this is my daily practice. This is how I live my life. 98% of my family still lives in Panama. So how would I not speak Spanish? And so I've always been stuck in between trying to figure out where do I belong. And it wasn't until I had a really serious conversation with my mom when I was in my 20s. So someone said my name totally wrong. So my name is Yaritza Villalba. And I think she called me Yaritza. And I answered to her. And my mom, when I say she lost it. And we were in public and she said, don't you ever have somebody, rename you. I know what I named you and you know how to pronounce it. And from there it was like, okay, you got to do better with understanding who you are. And then I began to ask more questions. Okay, we got to Panama, but how did we get there, right? And as a history teacher, of course, I know some history, but I wanted to hear directly from my family members because whenever we're together, we tell stories. And I always question, why didn't we tell a story that our life and our journey began on a continent of Africa?
And then being a social studies teacher who also teaches history to students, how did that counter story element factor into your instruction early on when you started?
So I knew that the textbooks that we had in the classroom was based off of one perspective and not all. So I had a principal who really respected my work, and she respected the fact that I thought out the box. Like for me, it was, we don't need this. And you spent $20,000, girl, we do not need that textbook. And she used to laugh all the time. And I remember her saying, so why don't you write one? And I said, did she just tell me, girl, I got this. She gave me the summer and I created our first interactive notebook. And what I did was I kind of focused on not only the history that students would be assessed on, but the history that's missing out, right? So if I'm focusing on World War II, then I need the students to tell me what African Americans and Africans were doing at that time. How did it impact Black communities? Why are things the way they are today? So yes, we're learning about the past, but you have to make that connection with why our communities and our families are the way they are today. And it went, I think I did 3 different ones until she said, you might as well just self-publish on Amazon. And I was like, I don't want to. She was like, yeah, you need to. And I remember my students coming back after they would graduate and say, I used this in college. Like all of your notes worked for some of my first papers in college. And from there, I literally had that first book on Amazon, and it turned into, well, we no longer need textbooks. The only thing I need in my class is that interactive notebook and dictionaries. And slowly but surely, it built the confidence of my students up, because I'm teaching history from all perspectives. And so my students are not feeling like, where's my history? Why are we not learning about our own people at this time, right? So yes, we talk about Japanese internment, but why are we not talking about African Americans? When we talk about the 1920s, we talk about the Ford automobile and the assembly line, but why are we not talking about how African Americans and Africans were being treated? And so it was more of, yes, you need to know this, but you also need to know this part. Or if we have some community-based organizations that target specific things within our community, then I always say, why do you believe this person created that opportunity for our community? What was lacking? And now you do the research, right? So trying to give my students opportunities not only to learn about history, but why we have certain organizations that target our community, and that's within our communities.
The Identity Talk for Educators Live podcast is just one piece of the work that we do under Identity Talk Consulting, which we've had since 2019. And since then, we've had the privilege of working with 40 different schools, districts, and organizations across the globe. And we want to continue to add to that number in this new year. So if you are a school, if you're an educator or an organization that's looking to receive professional development and consulting services within any of our pillars, whether it's anti-bias, anti-racist practices, culturally responsive teaching, or identity affirming education, we are the firm for you, and we love to learn more about your needs. When you have a chance, make sure you go to our website at identitytalk4educators.com to learn more about our services and to schedule a discovery call today. We love to hear from you. So as I'm listening to you, I'm starting to see how the early foundations of McKenzie's Adventures came to be, because I'm starting to hear elements of counter storytelling, invisibilized narratives that aren't in our curriculum, at least in our history curriculum or social studies.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was the aha moment, or were there other aha moments along the way that just made you realize, all right, I need to go ahead and create something that's going to really center this work.
Yeah, this wasn't that. So McKenzie's Adventures was not the aha moment just yet. At that time, I began to share a lot of my student success stories on Twitter. And I motivated myself to create a nonprofit. I said, you know what? No one's doing this. No one's helping out our Black and brown teachers without saying you have to pay for this workshop. So what if I create a nonprofit? At that time, it was Widely Educational Resources. And I would give like 3 workshops over the summer. Usually max is 500 teachers at a time, opened up to every single teacher who wanted to be involved. And I either targeted parent engagement, student engagement, or teacher engagement, and they get to choose their path. And I kind of like boosted it up by just integrating technology, right? And during the pandemic was when it just shot up. Everyone was just like, I need to know more. But then I realized it was because of the buzzwords, right? They needed to know more about equity and anti-racism. And the reason why I'm calling them buzzwords is because the people who I believed did the work at that time no longer serve that purpose or do the work now, right? So people who I believe were on the same journey as I was with making sure that there was equitable resources for our communities are no longer talking about that. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it was, all right, you have this nonprofit, you have something to say, and you have students who also want to say it. And then I remember receiving a DM from Microsoft. And they were like, hey, we want to feature what you and your students are doing on a global platform. And I was like, okay, sure. It seemed fun. Okay, I'll have one of my students log on with me. We'll talk about what we're doing in class in regards to TikTok and using TikTok for test prep. And I remember like making a post saying, I think it's time for me to dig into the EdTech space, because I realized I was already leveraging technology for my students, but people only knew about using certain platforms, as opposed to, hey, I'm going to use immersive reader because my students not only speak Spanish, but it's different dialects in Spanish. And immersive reader, as a tool, understands there's different dialects to many, languages. So I'm not just translating, I'm meeting my students and their families where they are and according to their specific needs. And Microsoft at that time DMs me and they're like, we have an offer for you for a part-time position as a consultant, and you get to stay in the classroom. And I was like, okay, I want to learn more. And they were like, we want to give you your own show on culturally responsive teaching. And so, so I had my own show with Microsoft for 3 years. It was called #Ask Yaritza, where educators around the world would ask me questions on culturally responsive teaching. And I would provide answers, but I would bring educators onto the platform with me, right? So the idea was, I don't know all the answers, but I know some educators who are doing this work. And if it's a question on computer science or project-based learning, I'm bringing them on regardless of what country. So if I need to film the night before at 4:00 in the morning to make it live on Monday, we're going to do it. We're going to make it happen. And that was the aha moment. That was I can do what I'm doing in Brooklyn in every single country, because there are teachers in every single country that want to do the work and just don't know where to start. And there's teachers who are afraid to do the work because folks are saying, you can't use certain books. Folks are saying you can't say certain vocabulary terms. You can't say equity anymore, right? You can't say anti-racism. And so teachers who at one point were so bold and raw and unapologetic in their curriculum and their classes are now saying, I don't want to get fired. And so my favorite line was, well, I'll do it for you. They can't fire me. So bring me on and let me just say it out loud to your students. And that's how I began to even do live seminars with students of all ages, just talking about who they were and what do you like and what's your culture and what food do you eat. And once teachers begin to hear that conversation, I go, so how are you going to integrate that into the lesson?
Yeah, I think that's crucial, because if we can lean on the stakeholders to do that work for us, especially our teachers who are still in the classroom, that makes our life a little bit easier, because you can't police the stakeholders.
Hello.
The stakeholders can make a lot more noise, especially if you're in a unionized state like New York. In my case, Massachusetts, when I was teaching there, the worst thing that could happen in a district within those states is bad press. No district wants to get bad press. So
that's it.
Yeah.
And in New York, I mean, they knew the work that I had began with Microsoft because I was highlighting my students, right? So it was like, y'all are technically getting highlighted through what I'm doing on a global scale. And then Microsoft loved what I was doing so much that they said, okay, so what's next? I see that you're getting bored. What's next? Because I was getting bored. I was like, And that's when I began my global initiatives. I created global cultural exchanges across 6 continents. We did that 6 times. We did it on Climate Action Exchange. We did Global Music Exchange. And now I have one coming up with Nigeria on a Global Hour of Code in August of this year. And that's without Microsoft.
So all these opportunities are happening. Now, mind you, you're moving up the ladder. You going from a social studies teacher, you eventually become an assistant principal. So now you're in administration within the schools you're in. But you have this burgeoning interest in EdTech and these other projects that you're doing. So at what point did you tell yourself, I need more than what's happened in this classroom? This is great, being an assistant principal, getting these promotions, but this isn't filling my cup the way that I needed to at this moment.
I visited Morocco. So when I visited Morocco, I had already agreed to be a full-time consultant with Microsoft. So my global work was already taking off. I went to Morocco for my birthday, but this is what I usually do, Kwame. I set up a birthday trip, and then I'll try to figure out what educator I know or I've connected with that lives within that country. So if it's Ghana, Nigeria, Morocco, I'm going to reach out to someone and say, hey, can I visit a school while I'm there? Yes, I know it's my birthday, but I can take some time out to visit a school. And with Morocco, I knew a brother and sister out there. And they were like, we could do you one better. Not only do we want you to do a school visit, but we would love for you to do an EdTech summit with our students. And I was like, oh, I'm down. And it was in City Council, Morocco. And I had 6 of my friends with me. Most of my friends are educators. So, you know, some were principals, assistant principal, guidance counselors. And I was like, do y'all want to come with me? And they were like, yeah, we want to go to the school visit with you. What we didn't know was the school threw me a parade. So we drive in and it's like a whole parade. Everyone's in their traditional wear. They welcome me. They have both flags. They do the national anthem for both countries. We get in and it's time for me to do a seminar. No one has any technology devices. The seminar is on technology. And at that moment, it was just like, so what you going to do? Either you're going to say you can't do this or you're going to make it work. And so I had my cell phone. And one of the teachers had the laptop that we had set up. And I said, listen, I'm about to download this app. And everything that I do on my phone, we're just going to project it here. And then you're just going to point whatever to the wall. And we're going to hope that the students can see it on the wall. Now put some kind of paper there, right? And she was like, okay. And it was so cool because, all right, so in Morocco, they also speak Spanish. And those 2 educators, I called, you know, I always say they're my brother and my sister. So while we were there, I wasn't speaking Moroccan Arabic because I don't know how to speak Arabic, but I was speaking Spanish. And the kids were just like, because I'm used to speaking to them in Spanish as well. And so we're just like giggling because I'm like, I'm going to make this work. Because I didn't want the kids to know that in my mind. I was like, what is going on? But that was my moment where I said, oh, I need to get into more. I need to get into more schools and I need to show them how they can be successful at learning about technology in an unplugged way. So even when we're talking about coding and people are usually like, hey, well, we don't have the resources. And I go, do you have pen and paper? You can teach algorithms. You could teach debugging with pen and paper. I could teach you how to debug and how to know the steps of algorithm through dance, right? So why are we not taking advantage of teaching our kids the terminology and the skills that they need in order to get one of these jobs that's going to pay them really a good amount of money.
Yep.
But we don't need computers for it, right? And so that was my moment where I was just like taking me back to culturally responsive teaching and understanding that our students all have different experiences, but they're willing to learn if we give them the chance to do so. And so for me, that was the moment where I was like, oh, McKenzie's Adventures, here we go. McKenzie's actually my daughter. So I name a lot of what I do after my kid. And we could go into that a little bit later, but that was the moment where I was like, I need McKenzie's Adventures. I was still working with Microsoft, but it was almost towards the end of last year where I left my 9-to-5 with Samsung and was like, I'm full speed ahead to McKenzie's Adventures.
Hi friends, it's me, Thaddeus from Thaddeus Nature Notebook. Are you loving our journey into the wild and learning all about awesome animals? Then don't forget to subscribe. You can find Thaddeus Nature Notebook on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Just hit that subscribe button and never miss a new episode. And if you're on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and leave a comment about your favorite animal. Thanks for listening and exploring nature with me. Let's keep discovering together. Now back to my daddy's self.
Yeah.
And then let's talk about that. So tell me a little bit about that transition, going from being an assistant principal to now, I'm going to be running McKenzie's Adventures. You know, I'm going to stop all the Microsoft work and I'm going to just focus on this full time. Yeah. Just walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah. And I didn't stop the Microsoft work. I just got really smart at how I'm going to do the work. So I no longer work for them, but now I'm a global training partner, which means I can still train people on Microsoft products and folks can still pay us for the services as opposed to going through Microsoft. So I got real smart at how to still use the skills that I've obtained with being with Microsoft for 3 years and leveraging everything that I've learned in the people in my support system, because it's also the relationships that you build to say, hey, well, we're a global training partner, so you can still rely on us to do X, Y, Z. That transition so I went from being a classroom teacher to being an assistant principal, to being a full-time consultant with Microsoft, to, yes, at that time I was still keynoting for other companies because Microsoft is so awesome. And then I left Microsoft 2 years ago, and I was like, okay, let me dibble and dabble into McKenzie's adventures. That didn't last too long. It was like a month of just being by myself until Samsung was like, hey, we need you. You're in New York. We need someone with your skill set. And I was like, God, I don't really want to work for anyone. And it was like, we really, really, really need you. And at that time, a friend of mine was working for Samsung Education. And I was like, all right, they got the bro calling me. My brother's calling me. And, you know, sometimes it's hard to say no to our friends. And so I said yes. So I said yes. And everything was smooth. I was still running McKenzie's Adventures. It just wasn't on a full-time basis. And it wasn't until October of last year where, for me, I felt like it was a calling from God. So I received an email from Samsung basically talking about my social media presence on LinkedIn. And the terminology that was being used was that it seemed that me scaling or my post was in competition with Samsung paid PD offering. And I remember sharing that with some friends, and they were like, so what are you going to do? You're going to miss out on a lot of money. And I said, girl, that's God telling me it's time for me to go. If a company like Samsung is using the word competitive, I'm doing something right. I got to go. I got to go. So that was on a Thursday. I put in my 14-day notice that Friday. I didn't give anybody the heads up. I wrote the email saying, hey, today begins my 14-day notice. Because there's two things that I believe my mom really, really instilled in me from early on, right? Which is you don't second guess anything. And the other is when God has a mission for you to get on, you get on board and you don't question it. And for me, that email was just like, I'm doing something right. I gotta go. It's my time to go. Y'all are holding me, y'all are holding me back. And that's exactly what happened. So like literally I put in my 14-day notice, Kwame. The 14 days was over. We're in December. I get an email for Q Spring to keynote for March. So I made a TikTok, like,
look at God.
And now I'm going to Palm Springs. But it's just, for me, reaffirming to know that it was meant for me to leave. Maybe they were holding me back from everything else that I could have done in 2024, but now it's time for me to do it in 2024.
And Yaritza, correct me if I'm wrong, because you did post about this when you did make that transition. A part of it too was about work-life balance, because with the job, you're required to travel a whole lot, which meant being away from McKenzie, your daughter, and not being able to spend as much time and be as present of a mother as you want to be. So by you leaving, now it's like, okay, I can reclaim some of that time and still do me professionally and have that balance that I was looking for.
Correct. And it was, so my deal with Samsung was 30% travel, which is normally the deal for any big tech company that you're working with when you're doing training.
Sure.
And that same week that I received the email about my competitive social media scaling, I had received a call from the folks who hold my contract with Samsung saying that Samsung wants me to agree to the 80% travel. So you wanted me to change 30% to 80%. And so that was like another thing, or like the cherry on top of the sundae, where it was like, you think that I'm going to stop being present for my kid for money? It's never that serious for me. It's never that serious for me. For me, it's, I need to experience everything with my daughter. And that was the same agreement even when I went to Microsoft, right? The idea was, well, if I leave being an assistant principal, what does that look like for my daughter? At that time, my daughter was a newborn. And Microsoft said, we'll pay you what you're making as an assistant principal, and you'll stay home 100% of the time. And so, and that's why I said Microsoft was just, they were amazing, right?
Wow.
A lot of my fight and a lot of what I do now is because of the leadership that I've experienced and I've encountered in Microsoft, some of whom I'm still close friends with, who still give me advice to this day, like, go get it, set a number, stand with that number. If they don't like it, they just don't like it. Like my manager, Journey Armand, she's from New Orleans, she's an amazing sister. And she's always in my ear. Girl, tell them that number. Tell them that number. If it's too high, then oh well. They called you. You didn't call them. So that's the kind of people that I have, you know, in my circle. But yeah, they changed my travel from 30% to 80%. But there's something in me that says that they did that on purpose because they wanted to minimize me scaling and having, you know, the opportunity to still do what I was doing with my own business. 80% means I'm not doing anything but traveling. That means I'm never home.
Exactly. And I know for a lot of people who do those jobs, typically they're single, they don't have kids, so they have the ability to be that mobile. But that's not your case, obviously.
No, it's not happening. It's not happening. And I don't think that my role with Samsung was a role that was impacting education and students in a way where I would say, oh, but I'm impacting students and they get to see. No, I was training folks on a device, right? So that's another thing. When I question my moves, it's always, who am I impacting and who am I going to hurt? And when I decided to put in that 14-day notice, I wasn't hurting kids and I wasn't hurting educators. So it was like, I got to go. You can keep the money. I'll make it up, but I got to go.
But I know at the same time, with every stop you've made, whether it was Microsoft, whether it was Samsung, even your previous schools, you're taking something away to add to your arsenal. And look at where you are right now.
Always. And I'm still learning. I'm learning from this conversation. That's what makes us. That's what makes us educators, right? Is you don't turn it on and turn it off on a weekend. We're constantly learning, even if you're looking at a candle and you're wondering why it's still lit, even though there's no more wax in there. Like this is what we do. We learn. We have to.
And I'm learning too, just listening to you. So I want to learn a little bit more about EdTech tools. So of course, there's a plethora of them. And now when you add in AI and all the different tools that are out there with those AI capabilities, I have a question regarding how you see cultural responses sustaining education principles being influenced within the future development of these tools as it relates to project-based learning. We'd love to get your thoughts on that.
So when I was an assistant principal, I was an assistant principal of consortium schools. So they're what we call expeditionary schools, or focused on project-based learning. So I have a lot of experience in project-based learning. When I began my work with Microsoft, my position, and I always laugh about this, my position was always to ask, who did you think about when you created this? You didn't think about Black and brown kids, right? And I did it because I wanted them to understand how serious I was about equity, how serious I was about when you're bringing me on a panel to discuss anti-racism and equitable resources for students, that I'm going to hold you accountable for every single thing you say on that panel with me. And so when we think about culturally responsive sustaining education, I just want folks to really think about that culture and identity aspect and kids being able to speak to their experiences, but also to see that correlation in the curriculum. And you may not be the kind of teacher that differentiates every day, even though you're supposed to. You may not be that teacher that, you know, creates a lesson plan with multiple entry points, even though you're supposed to. You may not be that teacher that thinks about every single student, their likes, their dislikes, and their strengths in every single lesson, although you're supposed to. But that is a huge aspect of project-based learning. When you think about EdTech tools, think about how you design lesson plans for students. I have been exposed to so many EdTech tools. And the first thing that I always look for is, how does this align to students with disabilities? If you can prepare for the 3 to 30%, then that means you've covered the 97% to the 70%, right? So if you could prepare for students with disabilities, you've already prepared for everyone else, right?
That's right.
So a lot of people like to talk about backward planning and UDL, but I say you prepare for students in mind who have disabilities, and everybody else falls in. You're not forgetting about those students. You're just making sure that you've designed a lesson plan with these students in mind. With EdTech tools, I'm always digging in to figure out, one, is it equitable for our students? Do our students have access to it? And most recently, do our parents have access to these resources? Although I work closely with Microsoft, I also am dibbling and dabbling into Google tools as well. But there's also more platforms like Pear Deck that I've done a lot of work with, where I'm looking at how do you use immersive reader to translate text or work, but also does it allow where students to assess their own reading comprehension at the same time? How can teachers use this and leverage this in the classroom? And yes, I know AI is transforming how we prepare for students, but the one thing that AI is not going to be able to do is get to know the students that are in front of you. That's still your job as a teacher. And so EdTech tools are going to play a crucial role in what's going to happen for the next several years. We're in the fourth industrial revolution, right? And so I would say if you have some of those skill sets of a culturally responsive, sustaining educator, now your next task is to figure out how these EdTech tools that you choose, not someone else, because what might work for my students in Queens are not working for my students in New Jersey. And what might work for my students in New Jersey are not working for my students in Nigeria. I have to figure out who my students are and then what tools align to their specific needs. And then at the end of the road, what was the progress that was made, if there was progress made. So that's to me is a huge aspect of PBL and providing multiple entry points when you're designing effective project-based learning tasks.
Right. And I think the one thing that people need to remind themselves when it comes to EdTech tools is that EdTech tools, they have their different features,
Mm-hmm.
and they are to serve as scaffolds for those students.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're looking at the accessible features of each of these tools and you're aligning it with what the needs are for the students, meaning that you need to know how your students learn, that's the work that you have to do in terms of the planning piece.
Yep.
Now you're narrowing down what tools you're going to use. It's not the expectation to use 50 EdTech tools at a time. No, take your 2 to 3 that work well for your class, that work well for your population, and
Mm-hmm.
maximize on that. That way you're alleviating a lot of the workload and anxiety that typically builds up when you
Yep.
feel like, man, I don't know how to use this tool. This is a lot.
Right. Right. And just like you said, right, you have some teachers who, because of social media and they've seen other folks share their work and how these ed tech tools are working in classrooms, they assume that their students are now going to use it the same way or like it. We've already failed at assuming that our students understood how to upload the most simplest documents to Google Classroom. We found that out the hard way during the pandemic, that some of our
Yep.
students are lacking digital skills and digital fluency skills.
That's
And
right.
so, I mean, some of our teachers are as well, right? So when we're thinking about ed tech tools, it's like, if it took you 2 weeks as an educator to understand this tool, how long do you think it's going to take the students to do it, right? And if you had to sit down and really focus on it, that means when you introduce it to students, like you said, you have to scaffold it. But I think of it as like the standards. I remember walking into a classroom and doing some curriculum work with a teacher, and we were talking about standards. And I said to her, I said, just move it out my face. Just move them out. First of all, I'm not looking at 32 standards. Why are we looking at 32 standards? And I said, the standards should be the basis, but it's not the end all be all. It's not the end all be all. And so that's what the ed tech tool for me is. I always design my lesson plan on my curriculum, and then I look at where can it fit in. And if it doesn't fit in, it's just not going to be there for that unit, right? We still have the rest of the year to figure out what tech tool may support my learners. But I always say, go for the one that you know is going to support your community throughout the year, and not just for one single unit or one single lesson.
Yeah, and that's the way to go for sure. And as we're starting to wrap things up, and man, it's been a great conversation. I do want to get back to you, because you are a mother, and this is a show about identity. We're not just teachers, we are very much multifaceted. And I want to know, with McKenzie, knowing how our world is, especially now with all the social political hoopla that's happening around us, how do you as a mother continue to build the self-efficacy and confidence in her so she's able to walk down the same path as her mother is walking down when she grows up?
So I I mean, I'm a strategic planner. When I found out that I was having a kid, one, the mommy and educator in me was just like, oh, we need books. I didn't think about diapers. I didn't think about clothes. I thought about books. I went to Twitter like I always do. And I said, hey, I need y'all to send me some culturally responsive children's books. And I remember receiving over 90 something books to my house. And I read every single book and I was like, these books aren't culturally responsive. They aren't culturally responsive, right? They just might have a Black character or they might have a Hispanic character, but they weren't culture responsive. And Matt Joseph, I was having a conversation with my friend Matt Joseph, and he was just like that principal. He was like, well, if you're just going to sit here and complain, make your own. And I was like, all right. And in 24 hours, I sent him the manuscript. So that was how I created McKenzie's Time Machine, which was our first book. And that was just the voyage and the passage from the fact that, you know, all human life began in Africa, and then looking at all the accomplishments of Black and brown people. Because for me, I need my daughter to be able to open up a book and say, yes, I can be that. And yes, I can be that. And yes, I can be that. But speak to the people who've already done it. And I think that's an aspect that our history books is losing out on, right? So yes, I know what Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King did, but there were so many more people of color that impacted this world. So why are we not learning about it? And then as an Afro-Latina, my grandmother got sick. And the first thing I thought about was, dang, that's all our history, right? Is leaving with the matriarch of our family. And the first thing I did was, let me write down everything I remember about my grandmother. And she's still fighting, y'all. She's been in a hospital for 2 years. She's still fighting. She's not letting go. And I wrote down everything, and I was like, I'm missing some stuff. And I'm missing the stuff that, you know, growing up, the adults don't talk about certain things around the kids. And I said, I need to be in those conversations. Now I'm old enough. They got to let me in the living room and in the kitchen. I need to hear these conversations. So I ended up texting all of my aunts, and I was just like, tell me something about grandma that no one else knows. And then I put that in the second book. So the second book was McKenzie's Bisabuela. So we did it in English and Spanish, because obviously my first language is Spanish. La Bisabuela de McKenzie. And it talks about my grandmother, which is McKenzie's great grandmother. But the idea is that when McKenzie gets older, she's able to learn about my grandmother, but also our heritage. The fact that my great grandmother's daughter of an enslaved woman, and my great grandmother was born in Great Britain, and then she decided to migrate to Panama. And then from there was, you know, where I was born, and then we came to America. So that gives her a little bit more of her history, questions that I've always had, that now after having those conversations with my aunts, I have that information. And so going back to me saying I'm a strategic planner, my daughter sees her name in everything that I do, from the business to the books, to the contracts that I sign, to the keynotes that say CEO of McKenzie's Adventures, to the paychecks that my daughter gets for everything that I do, to the bank account that she has that says owner of McKenzie's Adventures, Mackenzie Logan. I'm strategic because I want her to grow up and say, my name has already been on things that has 5 stars or accomplished. Now, what am I going to do? I don't want her to have pressure. I don't want her to feel like she has to prove herself. It's more like, I did this already technically, right? Now I can just live and I can breathe, but I know who I am. And anytime I have to question, I could just open up a book. I have books that were made for me. And that's not every kid's story, but I feel like I needed to do that for my kid. I needed to be strategic, especially in the world that's always on fire. I needed her to have a way to sit in a corner and be like, I know who I am. And even though I'm in a crowd and no one else understands who I am and why I have these things, I know why I have these things. And I know the impact that I've had, right? Her being born for me, that was the only strength that I needed to do what I'm doing today.
And then the last question, which is a question I ask everybody on this show. How do you stay true to the teacher in you?
So as education is constantly evolving and changing, I've always made it a point to be one of those people that's willing to learn. And I may not be at the forefront of leading the conversation, but I'm willing to listen. I'm willing to raise my hand and say, can you please explain it if I don't understand it? So for me, it's more on how do you move on with the times? I've had so many discussions with teachers who are either the same age as me or a lot older. And I'm constantly trying to like nail in the fact that when the world is changing and evolving, you have to as well, or you're going to be left behind. And the only people that are impacted by you being left behind are the students, because it affects how you teach. And so for me, it's, although I'm not 100% in the class, some of these deals that I have are curriculum planning, which means I have to be there. I have to get to know the kids if you want a curriculum that's culturally responsive, right? So that keeps me alive, but just acknowledging that times are changing and at a really rapid pace. And so not being afraid to ask questions is what's helping me on my journey as well.
And that's so important to have that humility. So important. Well, Yaritza, thank you so much for
Thank you.
coming on and speaking with me. And before you go, please let people know how they can connect with you on social media, and also feel free to share about the services you provide through McKenzie's Adventures.
Yes, my social handle is at Yaritza.v __ on Instagram, and at Yaritza.v _ on Twitter. On LinkedIn, I am Yaritza Villalba. But yes, our services, we provide culturally responsive curriculum development. We provide parent academies on digital skills to parents around the world. We do STEAM and STEM focused coding curriculum and workshops one-to-one for students around the world. And as I mentioned earlier, our global initiatives, I create opportunities for students around the world to connect through technology and leveraging technology to bring about social change. And so if any of those areas interest you, please feel free to reach out.
All right, y'all heard it here. Make sure you connect. And that is going to wrap up our episode of IDTALK4ED Educators Live. And on behalf of Yaritza, as always, people, wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. And we're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.
Bye, everyone.